All right, Christine, thank you so much for being here. What questions do you have?
All right. Well, thank you, Craig, for inviting me. You really got me thinking. And I did actually do some research on Thessalonians.
Oh, wow. Me too.
It's definitely, this whole paradox thing really hurts my brain.
Yeah.
But we'll dive in.
Okay.
So Paul gets it wrong in 1 Thessalonians. Jesus did not come back in their lifetime. 100 years later, church leaders are like, we need to clear this up, so let's write a letter and pretend Paul wrote it. Makes one think, how can you believe in the truth of other books of the Bible? How do you know you're believing in the right thing?
The answer is you don't. And we have a tradition that is very important, right? We have a Christian tradition that tells you this is what we value and this is what we don't value. And what's interesting is the tradition is so wide that you can find very, very strong discrepancies as to what we actually value as Christians within the same religion, right? And so when we talk about, like, how do you know what you're believing is right or not, I would actually say that's the wrong question. For me, it's what have you found to be true in your experience? And how does that line up with the tradition you're currently working with, right? So for instance, I would say, like, the tradition has 1st and 2nd Thessalonians as a paradox next to each other, right? Whereas one says you have to believe Jesus is coming back soon, and the other says, no, you have to believe that Jesus isn't coming back for a while. The fact is the tradition is the one that bound them together and said they're both holy. And so for me, I have found in my own life experience that it's best to hold those two together equally in order to embrace the beauty of the present and then also hope for the future. And so because my experience lines up with it is why I'm able to say, like, I can believe this and feel like I'm still Christian, or what some people would classify as correct belief. Now, that may sound like it's way out there, but the fact is, like, God would never ask you to believe from someone else's experience more than your own. God is as close to you as God was to the person who wrote 2 Thessalonians and to Paul. And so God wasn't like, hey, I need you to trust Paul on this one because I'm not really going to show myself to you. That's why we are put such a strong emphasis on your own personal experience, because if it doesn't work for you or you haven't found it true to be in your own life, God wouldn't say, like, well, I'm testing to see if you can believe something ridiculous that doesn't work for you, just to see if you're faithful to me. So for me, that experience is what's really important. And we've used this metaphor before, but it's like a tricycle where the big wheel is your own experience, and then the two tiny wheels are scripture and tradition. And those balance you out, but the experience is what basically guides the whole tricycle. So that's from Richard Rohr, just to cite my source. You can cite Richard Rohr for most of my sources, and you'll be like, okay, you're good at that point.
All right, so Christians often try to get other people to believe what they believe, like mission trips is what I'm thinking.
Yep.
You said something about people feeling uncomfortable about what they believe, about being annoyed with other beliefs. So what's the point in things like mission trips or getting people to believe what you believe?
Great question. So there are some problems with mission trips, right? Because it can be just dressed up colonialism in the fact that you're exporting a Western way of life onto other countries, and you're dressing it up through the guise of Christianity, right? And there are lots of books that talk about some of the problems of mission trips, and at the same time, it's the same thing where we have to recognize that maybe there's some good things about this, and what envy can I practice toward people who still go on mission trips? Because there are people who go with some of the best intentions, like we see some with medical care, and we see some with dental care, and when those are prioritized before, like, the explicit message of Jesus, I say those are some of the best mission trips that are helpful. The ones where it's like, no, preaching is the most important thing is a bit problematic. However, Paul goes on those mission trips across the Mediterranean, and all of these people all of a sudden hear the message of Jesus, and they say, there's something in my experience that lines up with that. So we all believe in Christianity, or we're part of Christianity today because Paul went on mission trips. So it's hard for us to stand up here and shake our finger at those things when those are the exact things that led to us being in this tradition. And I would say, like, when you look at what Paul did with those mission trips, it was often an empowerment of slaves. It was often an empowerment of women. It was often an empowerment of people who were non-religious. And all of a sudden, there's like this, like, just movement toward equality that wasn't there before, that Paul really, like, I mean, in my opinion, he was brilliant because he really brought people together that were very, very diametrically opposed. So that's what I would say about mission trips is, like, yeah, I know they're problematic today. However, it's one thing to point the finger and say, like, they're the problem. It's another thing to say, like, well, what do I appreciate about that point? Is there something good we can take from this and apply it to our lives today? Great question.
So the third question you sort of answered in the end. So I thought about it in the beginning, and but maybe you can elaborate. So when you were talking about the first and second Thessalonians and there being a paradox in that Jesus coming again. So why do we continue to exclaim Jesus is coming soon and waiting for decades after decades? It's been like 2,000 years now. The SDA denomination even arose after a failure to calculate the exact day of return. What's the point?
Well, so that's where I would say that's where, like, I feel like I was misled about the tradition, because the first book in the New Testament is most likely 1 Thessalonians, and it's people saying, like, what's the point? We've waited for years and Jesus hasn't shown up. So, like, the moment that you actually express that could be argued that that's actually your first invitation into Christianity. Like, once you doubt the resurrection or doubt the second coming of Christ, that's when Christianity begins, particularly from when the Bible is written, right? And so there was always this idea that it was wrong to think that or wrong to hold that, wrong to, like, say, like, I don't know if Jesus is coming back soon. But I have found that that's very much a biblical theme, and the way they talk about and embrace it shows that we have a tradition in the church when we doubt the second coming of Christ, not just when we believe it 100%. So for me, it's the fact that it opens up wider, and while I have not given up on the second coming of Christ because I lose hope then, so I try to hold those things equally so I'm not, because I found that to be the best way to live. So, great question. Let's go to the congregation's questions.
Is it more difficult to believe in the Trinity or not, or in the second coming or not?
Whew, I've never thought competitively about my doctrinal beliefs, so let me think about that for a second. I appreciate the question. I think the Trinity is a lot harder to get your head around because there's 3 elements as opposed to 2, maybe. But Trinity is something that the church argued about for centuries. It was not handed to them, and it was all about, can Jesus be divine? Or is Jesus just human? And so Trinity rose out of that long theological discussion. So fascinating how that came to be, but I would say that's probably the harder one.
I'm actually less concerned about disagreeing with other religions' beliefs. Rather, I'm concerned about the beliefs fellow Christians have, specifically beliefs that cause harm. While I want to practice empathy, it's hard to validate someone who's actively dehumanizing others and or myself. What should I do?
Ooh, that's a good one. Here's what I appreciate about this question. It is tough to know because there are things that Christians have done that cause harm, right? And what we have to come back to is ultimately all you can control is yourself. So while it's easy to point the finger and say, like, they're part of the problem, so much of what we can do is hold up the mirror and say, like, how am I contributing to this problem? And if it's something that you haven't done, can you help change other people's minds by talking to them about it? So the best way to change people's minds is through empathy. So is there a time when you believe something similar? And can you share that with other people, whether it's online or whether it's personally? Because the only thing you can do is control yourself. So if that's part of your story, I would say own it. And if it's not, then you could say, like, is there anything valuable that I could potentially talk about to empathize with them? Because that's the best way to change things. So, last question.
Is the process of believing 1 and 2 Thessalonians simultaneously the same as believing Jesus being human and divine simultaneously?
Yeah, it's similar. That's where it's like you have to be comfortable with paradox to become spiritually mature. And I've had people say, like, how can you say that? And I say, well, fully human, fully divine for Jesus. And they say, oh, yeah, that is a paradox. It's all the same thing, which is if you resolve that with Jesus and you say, no, he's fully God, you miss half the message of Jesus, and vice versa. I know with 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, as you said earlier, like, it's easy to say, well, Paul was wrong. I mean, he was, period. Like, he said Jesus was coming back in their lifetime, and he didn't. However, you can still sit and say, even though it's wrong, is there something I can appreciate about this? And I think there is. So the thing with paradox or contradictions is don't resolve them. Instead, appreciate them and start to empathize. And I think that's the best way to understand God moving forward. So thank you, Christine. Thank you for all of you for your wonderful questions. We're going to sing one more song together.